The historical aspect of our industry gives us a good look at the rapid pace of technology and why it's so critical we stay current with the latest trends and the movements in the industry. And commercial electricity, when we really think about it, has only been around a short 130 years in the United States as a real factor. But we can see that in that short period of time, we strung the entire United States with enough cable to go around the world a couple million times, and we've accomplished a lot in the electrical industry in a really, really short period of time. And so you got to, when you look back at the history of it, and this is something I always enjoyed about the industry, is it's always changing. And we're at the beginning, at the infancy of electrical systems compared to where we will be in another 20, 30 years. So, and then you can kind of look at that and you say, well, 130 years electricity's been around. Well, really only about 85 years of that has been where it's commercially available. So that even shortens that window of how far the industry's come in 85, 90 years. Then you realize that computers have really only been in the mainstay of construction for 20 years now. And they really weren't very widely accepted, and plus Microsoft was so buggy back in those days that, there was more of a hassle than it was worth doing the work. But here we're finally seeing that in the last 5 years, and actually 10 years it started, we're getting better and better systems that can help us manage our projects in a much stronger way than we ever were before. So, we got to remember that everybody, this is the entire, United States, everything that we all touch has electricity to some degree. So you're really living in this dynamic environment that every new electrical device that's created or every new chip that comes online will force more electrical services to be required and for you to be aware of as to how they work and how to service that type of industry. So you really walked into this really neat scenario it's kind of a rock and roll, grab onto it and run like heck, because there will never be a dull moment in the electrical industry, I don't believe. And to give you an idea of that, I'm just going to take you back down memory lane a little bit. The only reason I'm doing this is kind of give you an idea of what we used to have to do, not 30 years ago, compared to what you guys are doing some 20 years later. So you can really see the differences and why these things are so phenomenally different, but that you want to maintain the same elements of management between the two. So as a young engineer, I was it was the late 70s, and I was selected to be a project engineer on a 50-story building in Dallas, Texas. And for me, that was a really, really big deal. My first big building, and especially being downtown, because downtown's all logistics and a lot of heavy coordination. So, but in 1978, we did not have calculators, fax machines, computers. Imagine living without your smartphone. Well, that wasn't in our game plan for some 20 years. And iPods, and we did finally get to a point where we had cell phones, but they were about as big as a shoe, and you'd put it on your ear. And if you could get a reception, you were doing really well. And those were, and they'd heat your ear up. They were so darn big and hot. And then you have to remember the software that goes along with it today. And to give you an example, one of my duties as a project engineer was scheduling. So we had a 50-story building, and we had 3 blackboards, the full length of this conference room. It was a really big conference room. And we had the entire schedule of the 50-story building, everybody, structural, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, the whole deal. And it was all written out in chalk on a chalkboard, because we didn't even have whiteout boards back then, and you chalk it all in, and then you'd have to calculate your float based on a calculation that ran through you'd start at one end of the blackboard, you go all the way through the first blackboard, come through the second blackboard, then come through the third one. Now you got to remember, we didn't have calculators either. So then you'd come back from there and come all the way back around and through that blackboard and then back through your other blackboard. And then you would have your positive and negative float for a specific activity. And then you could determine where the critical path was, because in those days, interest rates were 18%. So if we could shave a week off a job, it was worth millions of dollars. And if we could save a month, and in some cases we were able to do that, just shave a month out of it, saved them, multiple millions of dollars just in interest rates. So there was definitely there was a need for it, and everybody back then was much more schedule oriented because of the interest rates. So that just kind of gives you an idea how the software is just taken over and taken all of that work and made it so easy for us to look at the right answers. So, and this is another reason to understand why the formats of emails and electronic software and everything came to be what they are today. The email really came out of a need to rapidly be able to send mail, bypass the administrator, which was saving money. And then the thing that they didn't really realize is it cut out all peer review of your managers to the project engineers. And but nonetheless, that's the way it worked. And you in emails, which we're going to be dealing with in this section specifically, a good example of the way emails were handled. In our day, we didn't have emails. So what we would have to do is we would have to take a piece of paper out, and it was double spaced with a pen, and every aspect of management was handled on pieces of paper and pens. And then they would all go into that system that the administrator would then take it, and then she would type everything out. And then with a real typewriter, these are the IBM Selectrics that you saw so prevalently with the IBM stickers on them. And so she'd type it out, then you'd get your draft, and then you weren't even done yet. So if you wrote a letter in the morning, you'd have to get it through the admin. Hopefully you'd get it by the afternoon so you could review it with the project manager that night so you could send it out, okay? So now that's a heck of a lot longer than writing something up and hitting send, I can tell you that. But in those days, the project administrator was the one that was really, she was tough, and she'd make sure your grammar was correct and your English was good and everything. So it had to pass her before it got a chance to pass your project manager. And then at nights, we'd sit down with the PMs and we'd have to get all our correspondence approved. And then off you go again. The next day starts as anew. And in our current era, like you guys now, I doubt seriously you could imagine your job being done like that. It'd just be completely different. But the fact is, we were able to do it that way, and we were able to do the same size projects you guys are doing. It's just how much work were we having to put into it to make that happen. So, and then you still had, in that whole email process, we've seen where we could probably do in 10 minutes what has taken a day so far. And we still haven't delivered that specific piece of correspondence in the old school. We would then have to call a messenger service that would charge us to drive around Dallas and deliver all our mail every day because the post office is too slow. And so it was really quite different. You can imagine the difference in speed of communication on these job sites. So in the case of today's email era, it's usually a 24-hour rule for response. And, that's become the norm. If you can do it within 24 hours, you are completely on with business correspondence. And that kind of falls back from the old days when one day was the hardest thing in the world to do. And so we've always had that one day seems to be a very historical amount of time for you to respond or reply. And that doesn't necessarily mean if you're not able to answer the question, just reply and say you're working on the answer. So, as you go through it, you can really see that the historical aspect of where we are still plays a big role in how we manage things. But you can see the importance of learning the new skills and maintaining that integrity and that professionalism that's been through the industry for the last 130 years. So let's go ahead and move on to chapter 3.